So we now have another new book out. It's called Approaching the Buddhist Path, and it's co-authored by His Holiness and me, and it's the first volume of a series of books that is called The Library of Wisdom and Compassion. So the whole series will be multi-volume. This is the first volume of it. So this book has an interesting origin story. People who started studying Tibetan Buddhism like in the 60s and 70s, and to some extent in the 80s too, there wasn't much material that was translated into English. And, so we relied a lot on the teachings of our teachers. And our teachers would usually just take a Tibetan text and then teach directly from the Tibetan text, usually the Lamrim, the stages of the path. And the teachings were wonderful. The difficulty was that they were written for people who were brought up Buddhist, who already knew about rebirth, knew about the Buddha Dharma Sangha, had some kind of belief in these kinds of things. And so, the Lamrim started out with relying on a spiritual teacher, and then Precious Human Life, which is already talking about many different realms of rebirth. And then the stories to illustrate things were stories from Tibetan culture, that the Tibetans really resonated with. But most of us from another culture, we heard the stories and we went, what does that mean? What are we supposed to make of that? And then there are all these other concepts that we had never heard of before that just aren't in our culture. So we did the best we could, but it was clear that we were jumping in the middle of things. So after some time, I had the idea, it'd be really nice if His Holiness wrote a comparatively short text that the Geshes could use as a root text when they taught the Lamrim. And it would have, a lot of preliminary material about rebirth, the nature of the mind, a lot of this kind of stuff to introduce people to the Dharma, and instead of, jumping in right away in the middle of things. So I requested an appointment with His Holiness in 1993. It took 2 years to get the appointment. In 1995, I then requested him, please, to, write a text like this for the sake of the non-Tibetan students. And His Holiness said, good, but first we should make a longer explanatory text. And he said, he told me, gather the materials. They gave me some transcripts of Lamrim teachings he had given. And they said, gather the materials from His Holiness's teachings and go to it. So that's what I did. And I, took teachings I had heard from His Holiness, transcripts and all sorts of different things, and tried to draw out the essential points. And I came back later, a few years later, to talk to His Holiness about it, because one of my ideas was also that the book would answer a lot of the questions that Western Dharma students have that Asians wouldn't have, like, how do you know the Buddha exists? Or, how do you know rebirth exists? Or how does science interact, the brain interact with the mind? Or, any number of these kinds of things. So I brought back lists of questions that I had myself and that I had gathered from other Western Dharma students. And so over a period of years, I would write and then go back and speak with His Holiness and ask him more questions, and then take what he responded and integrate that into the manuscript and so on. And then after at a certain point, he said, this needs to be unique. We don't need just another Lamrim book. We already have many good ones. So you need to put in material about the Pali tradition and the Chinese Buddhist tradition. So that people get a broader view of what Buddhism is, and the Tibetans, really learn. The Tibetan students learn more about other Buddhist traditions. So then I went back and I did that. I went to Thailand. He gave me a letter, and I went to Thailand and I studied Theravada, and I spoke with my Chinese friends and, read books on Chinese Buddhism and added all of that. And so, I came back, and His Holiness, I think, was thinking one book, and I came back and it was like, this was halfway through. The rough draft was like about this. And so I think when I finally said, okay, I have to stop, it was over 2,000 single-spaced pages on the computer. So then he made it clear, okay, first we want a book about all the Buddhist traditions. And so that one came out a few years ago. That's Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions. And then the rest of it is going to be his major English language work, kind of founded on the gradual path, but with a lot of other material in, because he was always emphasizing that we should study the classic philosophical text and not just Lamrim. But then people come and, you take out one of the philosophical texts that's translated, and, one sentence is this long, because the translators try and do it, really excellent. And the vocabulary, you're going, oh my goodness, what does this mean? So what I try to do is take out some of the main points from some of the philosophical texts and put that in the corresponding topics in the Lamrim, so that people would have a book with that was more substantial, or maybe that's not the right word, maybe more in depth about certain topics, presenting some of them from the philosophical tradition as well as from the practical tradition. And so that is what the series, the Library of Wisdom and Compassion, is about. So this is the first volume. So as the first volume, it contains in it a lot of what I thought is material that would be very helpful to people to learn about first before getting into the Lamrim, kind of material that you have to know about first. It gives you a broader perspective. And His Holiness always starts things out. The first one is exploring Buddhism. So he's talking about Buddhism in the modern world, Buddhism and other religions, and so some kind of introduction. And then he got into the Buddhist view of life, because if you listen when he teaches in the West, he jumps right in with the two truths, the four truths, the nature of the mind, the four seals. He jumps right into this technical philosophical stuff, because he says Westerners are intelligent people and you need to give them things to think about so that they can, get a correct understanding from the get-go. So chapter 2 talks about the Buddhist view of life. Chapter 3 is about the mind and emotions. And so that came a bit from some of the Mind and Life conferences, the early ones, where we talked about topics like, does the Buddha have emotions? And so on. Okay, so that's much more practical. And then His Holiness's whole take about it's not survival of the fittest, it's survival of the most cooperative. So that comes in that chapter. Then there's a chapter about history, because I think that it's really good for Dharma students to have some perspective about the origin and spread of the Buddha Dharma, in the 26 centuries, or 25 since the time of the Buddha. Then talking about the three turnings of the Dharma wheel. So again, people get an idea about the setup of the teachings. And then more also about, treasured teachings, reliable teachings, His Holiness's and the Buddha's emphasis on checking things, examination, analysis, and so on. And then there's a chapter on the importance of kindness and compassion, and it has teachings on the 8-point mind training in that, because at the very beginning, people need to learn about mind training and how to work with emotions. You can't wait until the end of the Lam Rim to learn that. Then a chapter about a systematic approach and the different ways of approaching Buddhism that various pandits, various sages have proposed throughout the ages, different structures to give that. Then a couple of chapters that contain a lot of very practical advice. So on wisdom and faith, purification and collection of merit, the role of prayers and rituals, study, reflection, meditation, memorization and debate, these kinds of things that people need to know about before they even start. Yeah. And then a chapter on signs of progress, so how to kind of measure where you're going. And then we have a chapter on His Holiness's personal reflections, where he talks a little bit about his life and how he practices what he does in the day. And then a concluding chapter on working in the world, because again, people at the beginning, how do you have good health and deal with illnesses, maintaining a positive attitude, how to benefit others, engaged Buddhism, science and Buddhism, business and Buddhism, the arts and Buddhism, interfaith, gender equality, how to relate to other religions, how to be non-sectarian. So all these kinds of topics that I think are really important for people to learn about and think about before they actually start practicing the path. So you have some framework of the Buddhist worldview and Buddhist history, how the teachings are laid out and so on. So that's volume 1. Okay, volume 2 continues with some of the introductory material. It has some really good chapters in it, from especially when His Holiness talks about the relationship with the spiritual mentor and how to be a suitable disciple, these kinds of things that are really important for us to know. So it has other material like that, but I'll tell you about that in May when it comes out.